This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson, and I'm so happy to welcome back again Dr. Stephen Veerapen. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Rebecca. Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, I feel like I have to have you on at least a couple times every year.
I'm okay with that. This is a thing I'm okay with.
Okay, that's good. I don't have to pay him in advance to come. He willingly shows up. I wanted to talk to somebody about Mary, Queen of Scots, and I thought, who better than Stephen to talk about this fascinating woman from history? And I think before we get started, I would be kind of curious if you were to describe her in one word, how would you describe Mary?
Enigmatic.
Wow, I was not expecting that at all.
How would you describe her?
I guess, geez, now you put me on the spot. I think I would describe her as, I don't know. I feel like I always want to go towards that romantic side of her, right? And whether or not that's right or not, but maybe courageous.
Courageous is good. Yeah, I think even the fact that you hesitated there and weren't sure tells us something. It tells us that what is the go-to for this woman? Why?
Yeah.
Enigmatic. She's enigmatic. She can be multiple different things, and she was multiple different things throughout her life, I think.
Yeah, I think I just kind of wanted to start the episode with that to get a feel, just like you said, it kind of proves how people look at her. And today I want to look at not necessarily her whole life, but I want to look at certain aspects of her life so that maybe we can get a better understanding of Mary as a person and as a queen. So I want to start off with a queenship question for you. And how much did her experience as a female ruler maybe shape the way her actions were judged, both then and now?
Oh, I think that's a very difficult question because it's multiple questions in one. It's how did it affect her reign at the time? How did it affect her reign retrospectively? So how have people interpreted it in the centuries since her death? And even the years and decades after her death, how did her queenship sort of shape perceptions and things? To what extent did she fulfill the roles of a queen? And to what extent did she fulfill the roles of a king, which is something I'm hoping to talk about a bit today, because I think that's what she was going for. So a lot is the answer, I think. It affected her a lot. But I think that Mary, again, because she literally wore different crowns, so as a result of her being raised not just as Queen Regnant, but absent Queen Regnant of Scotland, but also Queen Consort of France, she actually had quite a lot of experiences of power, of being in the corridors of power and everything. Yeah. And I think that's why when we look at her personal rule in Scotland, so that critical period when she was actually present in Scotland and reigning, ruling, she was being a king, because her experience of seeing people in power had been kings. She had witnessed, I mean, she certainly witnessed a lot of powerful females as well operating. Catherine de Medici, for example, Diane de Poitiers, but she was a sovereign, and her experience of seeing sovereigns rule had been kings, and so she presented as, in many ways, a king. And Mary liked power. This is something that I think is very often overlooked. If you go down the romantic route and you see her as almost a victim, a perennial victim, poor Mary, and to some extent she was a victim of a number of circumstances, but she was trying to reign as a king, which was, I think, a very troubling proposition for a lot of Scottish men in the 16th century, particularly in those post-Reformation years.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the king thing, because that was going to be my next question too. So would she have been remembered differently if she had been a king making the exact same decisions that she
Oh,
made.
yes. And that's not even me just being overly pro Mary or anything. I think that's just a fact. Look at James V. His marriages, Madeleine of France, Marie de Guise, were not in any way expected to constrain his power as a king. If we look at Henry VIII, his marriages were not expected to constrain his power as a king. What I mean here is the idea of shared kingship didn't come into the equation for a male ruler. It did for a female ruler. We know this because it's one of the reasons Elizabeth famously did not marry, or potentially one of the reasons. I love the quote from James Melville, the Scottish diplomat who visited Elizabeth in the 1560s and said to her face that she didn't want to marry because then she would have to share power, whereas at the moment she is king and queen both.
Yeah. Well, what a predicament to be in as a female ruler in the 16th century. I feel like I would have been torn if I were one of them as well. What is the best choice? As a woman myself, I would have wanted to have a partner in my life, but not necessarily one that would take the power away from me.
And I think that's what Mary wanted. I think Mary wanted to marry. She wanted to marry well. She wanted to marry in a way that would retain the dynasty and would propagate the dynasty. But she didn't want to share power with her husband.
Well, let's talk about Darnley, because of course he's like the elephant in the room when it comes to Mary, Queen of Scots. Let's look at that marriage. And, do you think it was like a political miscalculation, an emotional impulse, or something maybe a little bit more strategic that just failed?
Yeah, I think it was neither of those things. I don't think it was a miscalculation. I think it was an ideal marriage. And I'm going to, in a moment, horrify everyone by sticking up a little bit for Darnley. No one's got a nice word to say about Darnley, understandably, but I'm going to maybe question that a little bit. But it wasn't a political miscalculation, and it wasn't a romantic love match. Now, this is something that I know a lot of the kind of big and really good history books about Mary have always presented it as. So if we look at Antonia Fraser's Mary, Queen of Scots, which is one of my favourite books. It's not just a good history book, it's literature. It's like a really good read. John Guy as well, My Heart Is My Own, another great read. Both present Mary's relationship with Darnley as based on infatuation. Mary was a tall woman for the period, nearly 6 foot tall. Darnley was taller, so it's presented as she fell in love with a strapping tall youth and just sort of cast her bonnet over the windmill. It wasn't. He was heir to the English throne in the male line by primogeniture because he descended from Henry VIII's older sister.
Yeah.
He was also a claimant to the Scottish throne if one discounted the Hamilton claim. The Lennox Stuarts were next in line, and this is going from James II. This was a political match. A bit of a coincidence that this queen, after having exhausted several other possible marriages, the one that everyone's probably heard of was the one with Philip II's son, poor Don Carlos, mad as a March hare. That went nowhere, and it was only after that conclusively closed that potential route to marriage that Mary married Darnley. Why did she marry him so quickly? Was it this whirlwind romance in 1565, the spring of 1565? Was she just swept away by his height and his good looks? I'm sure those helped. I'm sure they helped her. But yeah, far too much of a coincidence that this guy was absolutely critical in terms of dynasty, which is something Mary from her childhood was taught to understand and to respect, this idea of dynasty and rank and everything. So she saw that Darnley, I think, was a rival to her. He was a rival claimant to the English throne. We know this again because when Elizabeth I ennobled Dudley as Earl of Leicester, she had Darnley front and centre carrying the sword of state because he was a prince of the blood, prince of the English blood. She could at any moment have sponsored Darnley as her heir. She could have named him heir and people would have accepted it. His mother certainly expected it and wanted it. So Mary also wanted to be recognised as Elizabeth's heir. How do you do that? Well, bring him into your camp, bring him into the fold. And what I think she wanted to do was marry him and then sideline him, subordinate him so that he's a rival, he's now in her camp, but she's outranking him in that camp.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say I feel like people forget who Darnley's mother was. She was Margaret Douglas, for Pete's sake, like a powerful woman, someone who Henry VIII may have looked at in his line of succession at one point as well. Yeah, I feel like she is so overlooked as like this powerhouse mother behind her son too.
Totally, yeah. I mean, probably responsible for quite a lot of Darnley's flaws, I have to say. But this is the other thing I always underline about Darnley. He was a teenage boy. And speaking as a former teenage boy, if someone was to hand me at that age the promise of power and prestige and all of this, my head would be turned as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just young. Sorry for him a little bit.
I always wonder too, do you see him as spoiled as well?
Spoiled, but then so were a lot of the English nobility. And I mean, look at the Earl of Essex later in Elizabeth's reign, people that are spoiled and have their heads filled with ideas of power. We see it in the modern world. I mean, you see people, I think we hear a lot about Nepo babies nowadays.
Yes.
Darnley was a Nepo baby.
Of course, when we talk about Mary and Darnley, we have to kind of talk about their falling out. One of the things that I guess I'm curious, and I'm going off script on this one, but I'm curious about this. They in film at least, and I guess I haven't read a whole lot on him. They imply that he had syphilis or something along those lines. Is there fact there?
There is reasonable conjecture, and it's coming from two sources really. The first source is contemporary, and it's coming from contemporary medical reports. No one said syphilis at the time. No one said even the pox at the time. He was written about as having suffered measles or having suffered other illnesses, and historians later looked back and traced the kind of medical treatments he was given, which in one case, in his case of his last illness, was mercury baths, certainly baths anyway, which we know were used to treat syphilis. So that's one sort of body of evidence. The other is a skull that was examined it was either the 1920s or the 1930s and found to be pitted, and that could indicate that syphilis had affected that person. However, that I have questions. I have doubts about the provenance of that skull, and also that the cause of those pits. I'm not a medical expert at all, so I mean I'm possibly speaking out of turn on that, but I don't think that's the strongest evidence. I have to say that the examination of the skull, I think the history of his medical treatments is perhaps more indicative that he might have been suffering syphilis. But I still have doubts, because if he had syphilis, he would have had to have caught it very, very young, because if it was syphilis that caused his final illness, that would have been like tertiary stage, which usually takes decades to reach, whereas this guy was about 20.
Yeah, that would have been really young then.
Yeah. So it's an unanswerable question. I guess always with retroactive diagnoses and things, it's kind of on slightly shaky territory without an actual patient to examine.
Yeah, with modern science to look into it.
Exactly.
One of the other things that I think about when I think of Darnley and Mary is, when she got pregnant, that should have been like this super bonding, happy moment between the two of them. You think it would have brought them closer, but it seems to have done the opposite with them.
Yeah. So what happened after that marriage, after it took place, after this whirlwind? I think she married him so quickly because she was trying to pull the wool over his eyes. I suspect that and it would be natural for him to have assumed that he would gain power by marrying the queen and becoming king, and she named him king, not by act of parliament or anything. In fact, she very carefully did not do that, which would have been, if she'd wanted to defer power and everything, she would have had it done. She didn't. In fact, she avoided doing exactly that. She named him king by proclamation, which was a paper title. And I think the marriage came about so quickly because she wanted to dazzle him with the prospect of it. Once the ring was on the finger, no, you're not getting any power at all. And we have, again, evidence at the time of that, and it comes from a partisan of Mary's, actually Lord Herries, who had no reason to sort of make Darnley look good at anything, quite the opposite. But he wrote that after the marriage, Darnley only started drinking and misbehaving after the Queen sort of locked him out of the rooms of power, the council chamber, and had a stamp made. She did not want to share power. And so I think that's the kind of cause of disquiet in their marriage, is that he expected in 16th century Scotland to rule because he was now king. And instead his wife said, nope.
Yeah,
no.
So she gave him essentially a paper crown, and he was like, whoa.
And it took him, I think, until she, and again, according to Herries, gave him into trouble. So according to Herries, the story goes, Darnley started signing papers for gifts and things without her consent. And so she had that taken away from him, that right taken away from him, because she didn't want him doing anything political that she wasn't in charge of, which I think, from a modern perspective, fantastic. Good for her. This guy had no right to power. But from his perspective, in that time period, it was kind of shocking. And there were people as well, other members of the Scottish nobility, who were eager to take advantage of this situation and say to him, you should have power. You're the male. You're the king. And again, teenage boy listened.
Yeah, the whispering in the ears, that seems to be when all of the things go wrong in history, when somebody is pliable enough to allow others to convince them to do things that maybe they wouldn't have done on their own.
So speaking of Darnley, I think, Rebecca, that was Darnley's flaw. He was one of those people, and there are still many politicians like this now, who believed the last person who spoke to him. Always. And Mary knew this because she later used it to her advantage. But he was the type, again, being young probably, but also not particularly bright. Whoever was the last person to tell him something, that was who he believed, and he went with whatever they were saying. That was Darnley.
I don't know if you could answer this question or not, because it's, looking back at history and how you see him now, but what kind of king do you think he would have been if she had given him some power? Would he have just dominated her?
Oh, no, I think he would have been an incredibly weak king. I think he was just a weak personality. I think he was just someone who wanted to exercise power, but I don't think he had any particular plans for what to do with it. I don't think he had any goal or anything. I think he just wanted the kind of accoutrement of power. He wanted to be king and act like a king. And this was a guy, remember, that had spent quite a lot of time at the English court observing Elizabeth. So his understanding of kingship was how Elizabeth had been treated and had acted.
Yeah, he liked the idea of being a king and what came along with it, not necessarily the responsibilities that would come with being a king.
Yes, I think quite right. I think that's it. He would have been one of those leaders who just did whatever his advisors said at all times.
Yeah, that would not turn out well.
Well, I mean, if you look at who was advising him at this time when the marriage is going wrong, it's his kinsman, the Earl of Morton, who has all kinds of sinister motivations of his own.
I feel like when you talk about Mary, it's always Darnley that we want to talk about. It's always her marriages that we want to talk about, but there was so much more to her. And I feel like I want to skip over the death of Darnley because I feel like it's like beating a dead horse. That's the only way that I know how to describe it. We've talked about it several times on this podcast. So if you're listening and you don't know the story, I'll put some links in the show notes to previous episodes. where we talked about that. I do want to briefly talk about Bothwell because I feel like that is another elephant in the room. What was their true relationship? Do we even know what their true relationship was?
So we're back to enigmatic Mary. Once again, I think we can discount the Hollywood version, so the older Hollywood versions, the sort of Vanessa Redgrave and Nigel Davenport, I think was the actor, that it was a romance. It wasn't, again, it was a very sinister, as we know from the accusations of rape and ravishment,
Yeah.
a deeply sinister political relationship. So what led to this? So again, Darnley's dead. We know that Darnley's dead. We know that Bothwell and Morton were the engineers of his death, amongst quite a few others, but not including Mary, I don't think. And what is being said to Mary in the wake of this is kind of twofold. One, you are being accused of this, which I think brought about a kind of collapse in her, because one thing I think for me that just completely rubbishes the idea that Mary was involved in Darnley's death is throughout her life, she had a kind of horror of anything happening to monarchs. I mean, even at the worst kind of plotting against Elizabeth later, she seemed to never quite bring herself to acknowledge the reality that your escape means Elizabeth will probably be killed. She closed her eyes to that. We can maybe talk about that later, but she was being accused of regicide because she had made Darnley king. I think that was just shocking to her.
Yeah.
But the other thing that was being pressed on her was Bothwell. I mean, you should marry Bothwell. And he, of course, gained the infamous Ainsley Tavern bond that said, if you want to retain power in the wake of the king being murdered, again, I can't stress enough how big this was, that the king had been killed, assassinated. You must marry Bothwell. And a significant body of the nobility signed a bond saying she should marry Bothwell. So she married Bothwell. And I think it was an attempt on her part to try and retain power, as she felt, this country has just murdered its king. I might be next. And she clearly saw a groundswell of opposition because she just had James baptized as a Catholic right before Darnley's murder. So I think she felt power slipping away. Again, this is a woman that wants power. She felt it slipping away, marrying this Protestant Bothwell. As much as she didn't want to do it, but it would keep the country under her rule. So she thought, again, because her nobility, or again, a significant body of it, were telling her to do exactly that.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible that she could have ruled successfully as a Catholic queen in a Protestant country?
No, I don't think it was ever going to last. And I think it's always been far too much of a coincidence to me that she managed it for years by balancing things very, very carefully, actually. I mean, this is something John Guy's book is really good at showing, just how carefully she was having to balance religious interests, factions, and everything, and she did. It's only after she has James baptized as a Catholic that everything falls apart within weeks and months. All comes crashing down. Darnley's killed, Bothwell's forced upon her, she's deposed. All of it is kind of in rapid succession. And I think that's because she'd had to, and she couldn't do otherwise. She was a Catholic. She couldn't have him baptized as anything else. But it forced her to show her hand. And by having her son inducted into the Roman Catholic faith, she had to reveal, okay, right, I've been hiding it for the last 6 years, but this is my long-term plan. I'm going to turn the country back Catholic.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So that may have been one of the big turning points in her life when, I mean, at least that's what it sounds like when she had him baptized as Catholic. That's when things started to turn against her.
I think so. And one thing I always point to is it's a measure of her success that she held on as long as she did, to be honest, because if you look at James's reign, he and his wife, Queen Anna, were constantly being condemned as being too soft on Catholics, potentially Catholic, and they were Protestant. So they were being attacked in Scotland for not being Protestant enough. Look at Mary. Mary had no chance. She wasn't Protestant at all.
Yeah. Do you think, you mentioned the influences, the female rulers that influenced her in her past. Do you think if, let's say, for some reason she had converted and she became a Protestant, that would never have happened, but let's just say that she did, would she have been a good ruler, do you think?
I don't see why not. I mean, she was intelligent. She was good with managing people generally. Yeah, I think if she'd in Scotland
Yeah,
converted, she would have been safe. She would have been. She would have retained her position. Um, but the thing that is, it's so impossible to imagine because she would never have done it. So why wouldn't she have done it? For spiritual reasons. I mean, she really did believe in the Catholic faith, but she also had significant Catholic allies on the continent, and she wasn't going to give them up to change her coat religiously. The only time that Mary ever seems to have kind of flirted with the idea of conversion was in her early years in captivity, in early months actually, in captivity in England. And so why was she doing that? Was it just cynical? I think it was cynical, but I think she was also probably surprised by how the English Anglican religion actually had some Catholic elements, unlike the Scottish Presbyterian flavored Calvinism.
sure. Yeah. I often think about her choice to leave Scotland and what her state of mind must have been at that point to flee her own country. Like, I want you to help me understand what do you think was going on in her head that she was willing? I mean, was she afraid of being killed by her own people? Did she really think England was safer?
So yeah, one of the next big turning point, I guess, and so a lot of people have said she should have gone to France, and there's reason for that. She had dower estates in France as a former Queen of France. She would never have got armed support from France, however. If she went to France, it was to retire to France at 25 years old, which she wasn't going to do. Again, Melville talks quite a bit about this because he was there when she fled to England, and he said that she sent south one of her servants, John Beaton, with a ring that Elizabeth had given her, a diamond ring, which she was to give in token of friendship as fellow sovereigns, and Elizabeth would aid her against her rebels. So I don't think she was frightened of being killed. I think she was intent on showing and gathering force and not quite invading Scotland because it was her kingdom, but
Yeah.
returning to Scotland at the head of a combined Anglo-Scottish army. She's been castigated as an idiot for this. So what a stupid thing to do, going to England when you're a Catholic and it's a Protestant country. Elizabeth was never going to help you. Again, I think Mary genuinely believed that, like herself, Elizabeth saw monarchy as above religion, and so a fellow monarch would help her defeat rebels without sort of letting religion cloud the issue, which was, I guess, an ideological issue on Mary's part.
Yeah.
But again, Elizabeth had promised her, and that's something really interesting. Elizabeth and Cecil particularly kept pros and cons, as Cecil always did, kept pros and cons of keeping Mary in England when she arrived. And one of his cons was it's known that Elizabeth has promised her aid. So he acknowledged Elizabeth had actually promised her armed support if rebels ever rose against her. So that was at the time of her initial captivity. Years later, in late 1586, at her eventual trial, the English government denied that Elizabeth had ever offered her aid.
Of course.
So the story had been changed entirely. That had been rubbed out of Cecil's pros and cons.
I feel like the moment that she signed the abdication papers, that was a big moment. Is there any other point in Scottish history where someone signed abdication papers and was able to get their throne back? It seems impossible.
No, Mary signed those papers, I think, if you know the history of it, after having suffered a double miscarriage of twins. And then she was threatened with having her throat cut if she didn't sign these letters of demission, they were called.
Mm.
And she was told again, and she was given on, I think, by the English ambassador, actually managed to somehow get word to her. He wasn't allowed to see her, but he got word to her that any such act would be under duress, and so it would have no legal standing. It could be rescinded. So that was her argument for the rest of her life until she died. I mean, she died saying she was rightful Queen of Scotland and that her abdication had been forced upon her.
Yeah.
But I mean, there certainly have been cases in European history of monarchs being booted off the throne and getting it back. England has a number of them.
So it was possible. And I feel like I feel for her in that situation. What was she
And
to
that was
do?
a horrible, horrible situation. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's really difficult to even kind of imagine that.
Yeah, it definitely is. I feel like I think about so much her time in England and how Elizabeth treated her and how Mary react and what's true and what's not. Do you think, and you kind of implied that, Elizabeth seemed to support Mary at the beginning, but do you see them as true rivals eventually, or was this something that was constructed after the fact?
I think they were definitely rivals for the English throne, which Elizabeth obviously held legally. Parliament had acknowledged her as lawful queen. She was lawful queen. The big issue was whether she would remain queen until she died, whether she would be forced off the throne and replaced with Mary, or whether she would die of illness at some point but leave the throne to Mary. So there were a lot of moving parts in this. But Elizabeth certainly did not support her when she came to England at all, although I think in Elizabeth's own mind she did. It's when she's first in England, Elizabeth didn't want her there. I've always thought it's just a huge irony that Henry VIII, good old Henry, spent millions or the equivalent of millions when Mary was a little girl trying to get her into England, and then Elizabeth managed it and didn't even want her. Didn't even want her there. But Elizabeth just has a massive headache when Mary's there. Do we keep her? Do we let her go? If we let her go, how do we let her go? Is it with conditions? And it was eventually kind of decided, probably between Elizabeth and Cecil, the only safe thing to do is to keep her, but to keep her with some show of honour. Where it becomes very shady is someone we've not spoken about, actually, Mary's brother, Murray, the Earl of Murray, who was very, very Protestant, and absolutely begrudgingly took up the reins of power when she had abdicated. He made a show of not wanting to take this on, this terrible burden, but he'll do it. He'll do it. So he immediately came back to Scotland when she's abdicated, took on the role of regent, and then started working closely with Elizabeth and Cecil. And one of the most outrageous things, I think, and it's something that, again, the English government, sometimes, how did they get away with this? Murray was writing south saying, how are you going to legally justify Mary being kept in England? And the solution was, we'll hold not a trial, but an inquiry into whether or not she was involved in Darnley's death. Even though there was no legal jurisdiction of England over Scotland and things that happened there, that's why they framed it as an inquiry, not a trial. But Murray wrote south saying, okay, we'll get evidence for you that she was guilty. What do you want? And we'll make it. And what will you accept in order to keep her in England forever? So, I mean, that is, the letter survives, and it's him basically saying, we'll manufacture evidence against her. Just tell us what you want, though, so we know we get it right. And that's how you end up with those casket letters and George Buchanan's book of articles and all this kind of crazy, almost satirical stuff that was written up and presented as evidence that Mary was involved in Darnley's murder somehow. And she was never allowed to see the evidence against her. Her partisans that went to represent her at the inquiry were never allowed to see it. But it was used as justification to keep her, even though officially the inquiry found her guilty or innocent of nothing. Elizabeth just closed the inquiry without actually reaching any definitive conclusion either way. Murray, who Mary had co-accused or counter-accused of having rebelled against her, was also found not guilty of anything. But he was given £5,000 as a loan and sent back to Scotland to govern as a Protestant, and Mary was kept in prison for the rest of her life.
It really, I feel like that whole deal there still turned out poorly for Elizabeth, because Elizabeth was still stuck with Mary and what to do with Mary at that point.
Yeah, well, she had a solution within a few years. So after Murray was shot dead, assassinated by Hamiltons, the Regent Mar, who had custodianship of little James, Elizabeth was writing to him saying, I'll send her north, I'll dispatch her north if you promise to execute her within 6 hours, I think it was, get her killed within 6 hours. And Mar didn't want her blood on his hands either, so he refused this. So there was some plotting against Mary in the very, very early years of her captivity of getting rid of her, but only if it comes with her guaranteed death.
It was because she was a queen that everyone hesitated at executing her, essentially.
Yeah.
I can't help but like find some parallels, and we'll come back to this, but I can't help but find parallels between Mary, Queen of Scots, and her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, when Margaret fled to England too, where she ended up giving birth to Margaret Douglas. Obviously, her outcome was a little different.
Yes, indeed. She managed to live out her life. Yeah, there are parallels, and I think both women had married men they hoped to control, but who turned out to be more trouble than they were worth. Because I think, and I have to thank Linda Porter, the historian Linda Porter, whom I'm sure you know, who a fantastic book on Margaret Tudor that just reshaped how I thought about her. Everything I thought I knew about Margaret Tudor, I reassessed in light of reading that book. I was like, this is legitimately groundbreaking. This has legitimately changed my view. But yeah, I think she's someone that's often been romanticized, and people have written silly woman that was led by her libido into marrying these men, when if you actually look at those marriages and what she tried to do, there were political kind of calculations going on, and she was going to, or she hoped she could use their factional help and everything. It just turned out that the men had ambitions of their own.
As it always seems to be when there was a female ruler.
Which, again, not to be too harsh on these guys, that was the culture at the time. The culture led them to believe that they should be the ones in charge.
Yeah. Well, just like when I always have to go back to my research with Thomas Seymour, when he married Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, he became the owner of her lands essentially during that time. He took charge of everything, and so that's what was expected.
Yeah, and I think we often overlook that. We generally, and I understand this, they were still humans, and they did still have emotions, they were still people, but we often, I think, look too much at like the romantic stories, and we think just in personal terms, and we forget that these people were factoring in a lot more than just I fancy her or I fancy him. They were factoring in, will this unite claims to a crown? Will this build me factional support? Will I be taking on their kinship network as supporters and so on? So a lot of things that went into these alliances at the time.
Yeah, you're right. It's more complicated than it was a romantic relationship. There was lots of ambitions involved as well during that time.
Sure.
Mary was held captive for so many years. Was there ever a moment where she thought, this is it, I can finally go back home?
Oh yeah, the prospect of her returning to Scotland in various ways kind of bobbed to the surface and sank again over the years, which is cruel in itself, I think, to give someone hope and take it away. But she had reason. This wasn't her just being sort of, again, dreamy and romantic. I mean, if you look at James the First of Scotland, he'd spent 19 years in English captivity before being released to go back to Scotland, and rule and then be stabbed to death in a gutter in a sewer. But he got
Scotland.
back. I know, right? He'd got back though. He'd returned to power and to his throne, so it was always a possibility.
Yeah.
But Mary made no bones about the fact that she would work with anyone that was going to restore her to power. Whether that was an enemy of Elizabeth, whether that was a sort of enemy country of England, she would work with anyone at the same time as keeping up negotiations with Elizabeth for restoration. So she had multiple kind of plates spinning in the air at the same time, all of which were, I want power again. I want to return to rule Scotland. Whether that was, as the years went on, as James came of age, she increasingly put her faith in the idea that he would get her out and would rule conjointly with her. There would be some sort of, it was called the association. There would be an association between mother and son, and they would rule jointly. Again, this never came to pass, obviously, but it was a realistic prospect for a while.
That kind of reminds me a little bit of Henry II and his son, Henry the Young King, where there were two crowned kings. And, well, in that case, Henry II had more of the power than his son, but even that didn't work out very well.
Yes, I don't think it would have worked out. Again, politics, the art of the possible and all of that, something could have worked out. At the same time, she was absolutely plotting against Elizabeth, working with people who were actively trying to kill Elizabeth, depose Elizabeth. So again, she was casting a wide net when it came to options for regaining her freedom.
Yeah.
And I think she lied through her teeth. One of the things, again, that makes Mary so enigmatic is she wasn't, we don't want to infantilize her and again think just this poor woman that had all these terrible things done to her. She was actively working with people in the plot with Norfolk, the Ridolfi plot, with the Throckmorton plot in the 1580s, obviously with the Babington plot towards the end. She was up to her neck in all of this. But again, she would blithely lie and say, no, never heard of them, don't know who they are, nothing to do with them. So yeah, Elizabeth, again, and Cecil they'd made this inevitable really by keeping her, as you said. There were certainly pros to keeping Mary captive. You've got this Catholic queen now under lock and key, but you've also created a kind of focal point for every Catholic rebel or just general malcontent in England and beyond.
Yeah, it was an impossible situation for both women, really.
And it was all religion, I have to say. I mean, Mary's problems were inevitable because, as you said earlier, was it ever possible for her to rule in Scotland, in reformed Scotland, as a Protestant queen? No. I don't think, I mean, if you look at the history of Britain, or the British Isles later, sort of going into the next century, the civil wars, the quote unquote glorious revolution, it became very clear that the idea of I mean, it's still the case today. If you are part of the UK royal family and you, say, convert to Catholicism, you're cut out of the line of succession. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing? So there was absolutely no chance. Religion was always going to do for Mary, Queen of Scots, unless she had, I suppose, somehow decisively returned Scotland to the Catholic fold, which again, if you go back to the very start of her personal reign, that was presented as an option by the Cock of the North. The Earl of Huntly had said, if you land at Aberdeen when you leave France and come back to Scotland, we can sweep south with an army and get rid of all the Protestants and return Scotland to the Catholic fold. And she said no. And even the Catholic France said, no, that's crazy. You can't start by drowning Scotland in bloodshed. So yeah, it was a kind of strange experiment having a Catholic queen in charge of not even just a reformed country, but a pretty strict reformed country in terms of how Scotland went for Calvinism. It was never going to work. It was always just a ticking time bomb.
I always remember this scene in was it Gunpowder Plot and Treason where she comes home and she wants to go to mass and of course this is like a big no-no. And
Which happened.
she yeah, and she's in the chapel and you can hear people outside the chapel not
And Murray
happy.
had to bar the doors to stop a
Yeah.
Protestant rabble getting in and attacking the priest. I've always wondered, I can't prove it. I've always wondered if that was a setup. I wondered if he had whipped up some of these Protestant thugs and kind of rabble rousers so that he could stop them and sort
Be
of
the hero.
show that, yeah, be the hero, be the one that was kind of keeping her able to practice Catholicism privately. Because that's the thing. There's a wonderful article by Julian Goodare called Queen Mary's Catholic Interlude, and it looks at the very brief window, I think something like 5 weeks, in which Mary seemed, this is while she's ruling Scotland, seemed to actually being quite bolshy about restoring the Catholic faith. And then Rizzio's murder put an end to that.
Oh
So
yeah.
again, was that coincidence, or was this he had to die and sort of cut her off at the knees because she's starting to sort of push the Catholic message? One thing that I'd love to explore more, and I hope I will one day, is to look. I want to look at Mary's whole life at some point, but to really look at Rizzio's death and all the plotting and the plotters around it, and Darnley's death and all the plotting and the plotters around it, because the response to both of them was really quite striking to me. I'm sure people are familiar with the horror of Rizzio's murder,
Hmm.
and then Darnley's murder. Mary often gets looked at with suspicion because she didn't act sort of decisively or strictly in the wake of Darnley's murder. And people say, oh, she must have known who the killers were and was protecting them, because she didn't immediately just start chopping off heads.
Right.
If you look, no one's ever obviously accused her of being involved in Rizzio's murder. She did the same thing after that. We know she had nothing to do with that. In the wake of it, she didn't go after anyone in particular. There were a couple of very small fry that were executed. Otherwise, everyone that was involved got away with it.
Mm.
And yet she certainly had nothing to do with that. So I think it was the reason she didn't act decisively, start lopping off heads left, right, and centre after either case was she wasn't politically in a strong enough position to do it, because the people that were involved were often quite high up. In both of these cases, Darnley was one of them.
Yeah. I feel like there's so many times in her life where she was put in an impossible situation. Like, what was she to do? And then she's locked up. She's imprisoned in England, getting moved around, right? And she's like, what am I supposed to do? Yeah, I'm going to start getting some plots underhand, try
Yeah,
to find a way to get free and then do what
yeah.
I have to do.
And she was still a politician. I think that's, again, someone that wanted power. That's again what I keep coming back to, I know, but she was determined to exercise as much power as possible, no matter the constraints under which she was placed. So even when she was in captivity, she was exercising power in various ways, forming relationships with local gentry. She was forming relationships, sometimes giving birth to lots of rumours with her captors,
Yeah.
Shrewsbury. Um,
Yeah.
and have you come across? I'm sure you must have the letter she wrote to Elizabeth, and there's
Mm.
some doubt about whether Elizabeth got it, but it outlines all the rumours that Bess of Hardwicke had told her about the English court and about Elizabeth, how Elizabeth had been having sex with Hatton, had forced him, how Elizabeth had broke the finger of a lady in waiting, Mary Scudamore, with a candlestick. You can almost sense that Mary's enjoying writing this list of scurrilous rumours about Elizabeth and sending them to Elizabeth. And she even says, oh, but when my ladies speak of such things, I stop them.
I had not heard of that, so that is a
I'll
wonderful
send it
story.
to you. I'll send it to you.
I've always been intrigued by Mary Queen of Scots, and I feel like she is just one of those stories that, of course, we always say is tragic. And I feel like, when it comes to English history, it's always Anne Boleyn, right? And how unjust that was, and how people look at her in a totally different light. But Mary, on the other hand, I feel like people are still torn on her.
What I find online is for some reason, Mary is still written off as stupid and bad taste in men. That's
Yeah.
even by people that know a lot of her story. They don't seem to be able to move past that. I don't know why. She doesn't get the same, as you say, sympathy as someone like Anne Boleyn.
Yeah.
Now I think in some ways that's fair in that Anne Boleyn did nothing wrong when it came like for the charges that she was whereas Mary put herself in the lion's mouth by going into England.
True,
Which,
true.
not obviously with reason, as we spoke about. She was promised
Yeah.
support, but she was slightly more the architect of her own fate than Anne Boleyn, I think. But no, it's there's still a lot of prejudice against Mary. She's still treated as stupid woman, and
Yeah.
a lot of it is. And I'm not saying this all comes from men, because I'm sure some of it comes from women, but there's still a lot of misogyny against Mary Queen of Scots that I find stupid woman. She made stupid marriages. She had
Yeah.
terrible taste in men. People look at her as a kind of soap opera character rather than a politician, which is strange to me because if there was one thing Mary Queen of Scots was, it was a politician.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. That's one of the things that she doesn't get credit for at all. It's, she ruled with her heart.
Oh
She,
yeah, that phrase, Elizabeth ruled from the head and Mary ruled from the heart. And that's not what people were saying at the time at certain stages in her career. And if anyone was ruling from their heart in Scotland in the 16th century, it was James. It was James, her son.
That's true.
Mary. James was certainly the more romantic kind of emotional figure.
Yeah. I always just feel like it's so tragic that he didn't get to know his mother,
So
How,
I think it messed him up. But I know I'm
yeah.
probably being too like psychoanalytical, but I think the lack of love in James's youth tells very much later on in his life when this man is desperate for love from everyone, anyone. I think that's coming from a lack of either paternal or maternal
Yeah.
influence. I mean, he didn't know either of his parents.
It is tragic. I can't even imagine what that would be like growing up without your parents and maybe not even with any close family members
Yeah,
nearby.
and those that were raising James treated him either as king and to be deferred to, certainly not to be treated with any sort of affection, or as an experiment in kingship, which is what George Buchanan infamously did, is raise him to be a good Calvinist king, not as a kind of not with indulgence or affection or anything like that. So yeah, it's sad. So also sad that again when Mary was trying to in the late 1570s, for example, send gifts and things north. I think she sent a pony north. She sent a little pair of golden guns north, and Elizabeth prevented them from leaving England. So they were not allowed to reach their recipient, her son.
Okay, help me understand something because when Mary was imprisoned into England, where did she have the money? I mean, did she bring, like treasure chests with her full of coin and goods or?
She wishes. No, she was still Dowager Queen of France, so she still was entitled to the revenue from her French estates, which were funneled through the French embassy in London.
Okay, so she was still able to get stuff delivered to her essentially.
She was, yes. I mean, she was still, we shouldn't make out she was sort of cast into a dungeon or anything like that. She was still given a decent lifestyle, a good lifestyle. I mean, one could make the argument it's a gilded cage. It doesn't matter how nice the lifestyle is, you're never allowed to leave.
Right.
It taints it somewhat. But yeah, she had access to her own funds from France. She also was under the care of one of the richest men in England for about 15 years, Shrewsbury, and he was a reasonable man. I mean, he actually was treated very badly by Elizabeth, I have to say, because he was putting his hand into his own pocket to allow his captive Mary to live as a kind of captive queen, but a queen nonetheless. Whereas Elizabeth and her government were quite stingy with his emoluments. They would not pay him as well as he deserved in terms of redressing his financial outlays. what you also find is constant complaints from Shrewsbury about the cost of this household that he's being expected to keep guarded, but to keep in state and everything. And the government turning a blind eye. There's a brilliant story. Actually, I think Elizabeth's funny. I think Elizabeth was just hilarious sometimes. When Mary first came south, Elizabeth sent her a package of clothes. That was as much support as she was going to give, but she sent her the worst clothes that she could find.
No.
So much so that her captors had to pretend that a mistake had been made, but a mistake had not been made because Elizabeth then wrote North saying, "What did she think of?"
Oh my God. I imagine like she's getting all these hand-me-down gowns that are like dirty and torn and
Yes, it was old black velvet, I think, and one dress, and yeah, some like maid's undergarments. I just think it's funny. Elizabeth was annoyed, and she showed it in amusing ways.
wow, I'd never heard that story. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like, see, this is the thing. There is so much about these two women and their interactions with each other that I feel like isn't always public knowledge until we talk to somebody like you who then shares it and we go, oh, okay, this is a lot different than we've been told by the
Yeah,
masses, maybe.
yeah. I think with Elizabeth and Mary, I mean, there have been multiple really good sort of dual biographies of the two of them, but it sometimes does get presented as just the clever, intelligent Elizabeth and the stupid, tragic Mary. And there was just a lot of complexity in that relationship. Similarly, I found it with Elizabeth and James, which I think is in some ways an even more interesting relationship. How often do you hear the story of their letters back and forth when they clearly distrust and dislike each other, but they're the same religion?
Yeah.
Elizabeth and James, they're both Protestants. But he wants her to die so he can have her throne, and she wants to talk down to it. It's just so interesting.
Yeah, yeah, the way that they played each other, essentially, they
Yeah.
make it look like it's all business, but really they were just playing each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's
But
going to be after Henry, my next project is a big biography of Elizabeth, which
ooh, that'll be super popular too.
fingers crossed, it's also going to be. I think what an idiot I am. It will take me forever. It's going to be a huge, huge brick of a book.
Yes, I was gonna say behind me I have one shelf that is all of my Elizabeth books, and I know that's only a fraction of what's available out there.
Oh yeah, that's the other daunting thing with a subject like Elizabeth. I mean, I've read every biography I can get my hands on of
Yeah.
Elizabeth. And again, she's always different in every one.
Yeah.
There's always something different. So again, as I did with Henry, which I know is not out until August, I'm looking at some of the sources from elsewhere in the British Isles. So not just the English sources about what
Right.
Elizabeth was up to, but what was being said in Scotland and written about her, what was being said and written about her in Ireland. It's not so good.
I think that's great. That's so important to look at outside sources because, of course, the English had their own agendas and they were only going to
Yeah,
write about what they wanted you to know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a whole untold story of just Elizabeth in Ireland, as I'm sure you know.
No,
Something that
I
I mean, I was
don't.
reading a I was reading a biography of Elizabeth, a well-known biography, and Ireland wasn't mentioned for something like the first 300 pages, or not a word. I mean, you might not have known that Ireland existed. Just
Yeah.
like this is bit of a problem because it was woven throughout her reign. In fact, it's one of the reasons. This is totally off topic of Mary Queen of Scots now. Um, but when Elizabeth died, and I know there's been a lot of recent debate about whether James was the rightful heir, which
Mm,
he was, but I think the reason is Ireland at the time was in a ferment, and if James had been passed over, and let's say Arbella Stewart or something had become the next sovereign, and James had been rebuffed, he already had contacts in Ireland. So Queen Arbella would now not just be trying to govern England, but facing a very angry Scottish king with Ireland already up in arms of coming from both directions. So, yeah,
yeah, I feel like you're so right. Even when I read about Henry VIII's reign, so seldom does Ireland come into the conversation. It's like it doesn't exist. It's an afterthought.
I will send you an advanced copy of Overlord. See what you think of Henry in Ireland.
I'm so excited. Well, we're going to talk about that at the very end here. I just got a couple other things that I want to cover, and I know we've been going at it for about an hour now, but this is such a great topic. I do want to kind of bring up the casket letters. And for those who maybe don't know what they are, can you explain real quick?
Yeah, so the casket letters are a very mysterious set of letters which were presented at the inquiry in England in 1568 to 9, which purported to prove that Mary had been sexually involved with Bothwell prior to Darnley's murder, and therefore showed that she was art and part, as the Scottish phrasing was, of his death. And the question has raged over the centuries, were they real or were they not? And in some ways, it's the gift that keeps on giving because they don't exist anymore. They're gone, they're lost. All we have are copies of translations and those, even copies that made their way into printed works when Elizabeth had them printed to further disgrace Mary in the 1570s. This was after the Northern Rebellion. Were they real or not? I can say, first of all, the consensus now historically is that they were a mix of forgeries and letters to other people, because none of them are signed, or if they are signed, it's not in Mary's signature, or not in her recognisable signature. They're not dated. None of them are dated. They don't have addressees. So one is left to read what survives of them and think, okay, this is meant to be to Bothwell, and it does imply a romantic relationship, and so on. So you're kind of guessing superficially. If you read them thinking this is from Mary to Bothwell, it makes her look guilty. If you read them without that, you might start to notice, wait a minute, this doesn't quite add up, because there are things in them, there's material in them that alludes to people that don't exist. Like Bothwell's, if it's Bothwell, who's his uncle? Who's she talking about? Like, there's all internal evidence that makes them look less, in fact, disprove them. And every single one is like that. Antonia Fraser pointed this out in the 60s. It's not just a case that, okay, one of them is problematic and the rest are kind of damning. They're all problematic. They are all have evidence that can be used to debunk them, which suggests to me that whoever was behind them might have suspected that Mary would have been returned to Scotland at some point. And so they had to be kind of plausibly deniable. The other big thing with the casket letters is their provenance. So no one ever whispered a word about Mary, Queen of Scots, and Bothwell being romantically involved when Darnley was alive until she was a captive in England. But if you look at some references to a casket being found, there is a reference to a casket being found after Mary's been first taken captive in Lochleven in Scotland, but the claim was that it held her correspondence with France, which contained matter prejudicial to England. So when did this change to being something entirely different? So yeah, it's very strange.
Very strange. Yeah, it always seems like there's always something to make Mary look bad. How can we make Mary look bad? How can we discredit her? How can we take away her power?
Yeah, but the casket letters are just problematic.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you think it was inevitable that she was going to be executed?
No. I think if Elizabeth could have got away with it, she would have been quietly murdered, because we know that Elizabeth asked Amias Paulet, her final jailer, to murder her, and he said no.
He's like, nope, not doing it. Well, that's interesting. Okay, so then lastly, what do you think Mary's legacy is?
That's a really good question. Because critics have said, in the grand scheme of things, she was entirely unimportant. I think her legacy is actually more in terms of iconography and part of Scotland's kind of national story and mythology and all of this sort of stuff, because she's probably Scotland's best known monarch. And I know this annoys some historians because they look at James IV, they look at James VI and first, and they say, look how massively important these guys were. Everyone talks about Mary, she takes up all the air in the room. But I think that in itself is her legacy. She has provided this Scottish cultural kind of product.
I love that. I really thought you were going to say her son James was her legacy, but I love that you said.
Nah.
That seems like the classic answer that somebody would give.
That's usually my answer, and I decided deliberately to go a bit different with it.
I like that though, but as someone who I believe you grew up in Scotland, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What gave it away?
I just feel like, when you grow up in a country, you definitely understand the history much better and how people are portrayed. And clearly, you grew up hearing a lot about Mary too, and that, helped your answer
so
there.
you see it firsthand when you're a kid. She's one of those Scottish figures that you are just taught about when you're young.
Yeah. I wish I don't know. I'm glad that we're still talking about her. I do. I really am. I just wish that she didn't have all the negative things attached to her story.
Yeah. And I think that's just legacy of centuries of romanticism and also religious division has just had that's another negative legacy, I think, not of Mary herself, but of just British history. As you'll know, across the British Isles, religious division has just permeated and has kind of echoed down the centuries, still very alive in parts of Scotland at the moment.
Yeah. I do have every Sunday, I have a series called Off the Record that I do with Amy McElroy. And we like to do we love to do what ifs. And so I have a what if for you now. What if after no. Let's say, what if Francis II had lived and lived a full life? How different do you think her life would have looked?
I think her life would have been very happy in France. If they'd had children, I think there would have been a lot of problems. I think they would have lost Scotland.
Oh.
I think they would have lost Scotland.
Interesting. So who would have ruled Scotland then?
Probably Murray.
I was going to say her brother.
Whoever, in fact, whoever England decided would have ruled Scotland, I think. Whoever Elizabeth and Cecil had nominated and supported would probably have taken over. And it might not have been Murray. It might have been one of the Hamiltons, because there was talk when Mary was in France of Arran, the Earl of Arran, who later went mad, of him being given the Scottish crown by Elizabeth as though it was hers to give.
Wow. I joke on Off the Record with Amy about Lord Darnley being a crybaby and like sucking his thumb in the corner and rocking when he wasn't able to rule the way that he wanted. But I imagine Murray, her brother, as like the schemer. He's back.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was an intelligent man, but again, often touted as, oh, he would have been a great king. It was just a shame that he was born illegitimate. And when he did get the chance to rule and wield power, he walked into his own assassination despite being warned about it, being told not to go. He wandered into it. It's going to be that great.
Wow. This just tells me that I really need to start looking at Scottish history a lot more, because there are just so many fantastic stories. Like, your history is just littered with drama and intrigue.
Lots of stuff, bloody executions and assassinations and plots at every turn. It's certainly never boring.
No. So if you're listening or watching right now, don't just look at English history. Try and branch out a little bit. Because like I always say, it's always good to get a full perspective of what was going on. It wasn't just England in the world. There were other countries doing other things that also influenced England as well. Okay. Well, I want to give you the opportunity, now that we've talked about Mary, Queen of Scots for an hour. I want to give you an opportunity to not only plug your new book that's coming out that you hinted at, but also your other books as well.
Thank you very much. So yes, in August, and I'm sure the American release date won't be far behind. I have Overlord coming out, which is a new history of the life and reign of Henry VIII, but paying attention to what he was doing to the wider British Isles, Scotland, England, Wales, and prior to that, yes, I got a book on witches, which touches on the history of witch trials, and a biography of James as well, James, Mary's son,
Yeah.
James, the wisest fool.
You've been writing for a long time, and I often tell people, I think it was like back in 2017, maybe 2018, you started sending me books. And at that time, I was so new to everything. I didn't know who you
So
were.
was I. So was I.
I have to tell you this, and I'm going to do it on the air here while I'm recording. I seriously, when you sent me those things, I thought that you were like a 70-year-old man who's sending me these books. And now, and then when I finally met you, I was like, whoa, I had that all wrong. But I mean, you've been writing for so long. You are a brilliant writer. You are a brilliant
Thank
researcher. And if you guys haven't read his books, then I'm sorry I called you an old man, Steve.
you. I feel like it on some winter mornings.
But please, please take the opportunity to order Stephen's books, pre-order his upcoming book called Overlord, right? I'm excited about this one. I'm excited to get an advance copy.
I'll send you one. I'll get one over to you.
Yeah. And is there anywhere online where you have articles published or anything like that that people could find?
Yes. Now, when I update my website, which I will at some point, I'll list them, but I think the existing ones are on my website. It's
Okay.
just stephenveerapen.com.
Perfect. I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for having me, as always.
It's always fun, right?
Always is.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.